Yo, so I had this big long conversation the other day explaining to a couple people of how not people have conformed to religion, or in their words, how people have conformed to God, but how we have conformed God based on our culture. How our religious writings have been doctored, or in their original writing was written based on the culture of the day, and how we have reinterpreted those things so that it can fit our culture of today. Now, there were many different examples that we could have talked about, but because of the nature of the people in the car, the main area of the subject was homosexuality and pedophilia, and the difference between the two as they are looked upon in society today and looked upon in society in back in the day when these manuscripts were written. So we're going to break those things down for a few minutes, so please stay with me and enjoy this moment. So what's up, everybody? How you doing? This is your coach Renz, and I want to thank you for joining me. I forgot my tripod, so this is on a handheld. So if we get a little shaky cam, that's because I'm holding the camera right now. But if you're joining me for the first time, we talk about the full 360 degrees of life that goes on in your life. And in today's installment, we're talking about your spirituality. This video is not to take away from your spirituality, not to take away from your religious beliefs, but it's just to give you deeper understandings and more of a conscious thought when it comes to what you believe and how you believe. And then when you speak to someone else, how you put this information out, your ideas, your thoughts, and hopefully as we become broader and more understanding, then we will also find more tolerance for one another and be able to truly experience love for one another. So as I was saying in the beginning of this video, I was having this conversation, and the conversation hinged on the fact that the person was saying that homosexuality in the Bible has been written out of the Bibles that are written in Canada. So basically, they have their Queen James version of the Bible, and in the Queen James version, they don't say homosexuality is an abomination, as it states in everybody else's Bible that's been written ever since 1611. From 1611 to today, in the King James, homosexuality is an abomination. In the Septuagint, in the Vulgates, to a certain extent, these verses were there, but it wasn't as pronounced. Certain words have changed their meaning as we have grown. When Paul said that thou shalt not fornicate or don't fornicate, fornication in the Greek actually means having sex with young boys. It doesn't mean having sex out of wedlock. So we discussed these things. But one of the key points is that I expressed to them how religion has conformed to cultures, not cultures conforming to religion. I mean, think about it. In your regular day, do you really conform to the religion, or is the religion conform to your culture? Do Muslims in India practice Islam the same way as Muslims in Saudi Arabia, the same way as Muslims in America? Do the black Muslims worship in the same way as the Arabs? Do they in the Arab culture and Islam, you have polygamy. In the American culture, Islam, you don't have polygamy. You don't practice it. Why? Because it's illegal in America. And so you've contoured the doctrine to fit. We've done this so many times, and I can go on and on about different subjects. But one of the things that happened as soon as I finished that conversation with this person, I ran across these, which also made me think of the hypocrisy in it. There's one thing that if a church is saying, hey, homosexual people, we welcome you here. We don't want you to feel like you can't come to our church. But no, these things are saying Happy Pride Month. They're celebrating homosexuality, and at the same time, I don't go to these churches, so I don't know if they're preaching against it, but from the outside, it looks like they're celebrating. And I'm sorry, if you put Happy Pride Month, you are more than likely celebrating it, at least, or unless you're doing bait and switch. I'm going to bait you in with Happy Pride Month, but once I get you in, I'm going to flip the script and tell you that you're an abomination to God. It's hypocrisy or it's trickery, either way. But see the trend? Notice the difference? A Bible in Canada can't be sold if it says that homosexuality is an abomination. It's a change in the trend. It's a change in the way. But let's look at this in its full scope. Why is homosexuality a sin? And this is what I said to them. Why is homosexuality a sin expressly written in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Bible. But pedophilia is not expressly written as a sin in the Hebrew or the Christian Bible. And they stood there for a second. They had to think about that. And I want you to stand there for a second. I want you to think about that. Have you ever noticed that pedophilia is not outlawed? If anything, pedophilia is encouraged. It's encouraged. Now I know right off the bat, some people are going to say, well, it was a different time frame. People lived differently. And really you're making my point when you make those statements. It was very peaceful out here. Now I got the ice cream truck coming. Now I got the getting ready to do some lawn work. But anyway, we're going to keep going because y'all focus here. But yeah, so think about that. If you look at the culture of that day, let's break it down real quick because I'm not going to keep you that long. Look at the culture of that day. In these villages, these towns, these tribes consisted of 300 people. Was a pretty good sized grouping. That was a town. That was almost a city. So when you go back 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, if you had 300 people in a group, that's a big tribe. But it's still a small tribe. And these tribes had to keep up with the other tribes, the neighboring tribes, for warfare purposes, for being able to keep their land, for just general growth. You can't look at it from this 8 billion people that we have on, almost 8 billion people we have on the planet today. You got to realize that they were much, much, much smaller communities back then. And in these smaller communities, they had to protect themselves. They had to protect themselves from being overrun, protect themselves in order to keep land. They had to protect themselves. And the land didn't have as much vegetation, so they had to keep their population controlled as well. And one of the ways they had to do this is to recognize the value of having families. If you had a big family, you had more protection. You had a big family, you had more farmers, more workers. So they had to keep the family size. What goes against keeping the family size? What goes against keeping the village, the town growing? Homosexuality. If you allowed homosexuality, then what you've effectively done is said that, well, we can't necessarily keep growing our tribe. I can't produce a son with 2 dudes. I can't produce a son with 2 daughters. I got to have a man and a woman. So making homosexuality illegal allows for that. Making it again and then putting God's name on it really allows for it. I'm gonna switch places. Really allows for it. So what do they have to do? You have to get rid of homosexuality. Now notice, pedophilia, you can keep that. You can keep pedophilia. Why? Because that's still a man and a woman. It didn't matter if the girl was little. You got to have it. They had other rules to keep the village to grow. And let's talk about pedophilia for a second. Most people will accept that Jesus was born from if you believe in Jesus, that Jesus was born from a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, somewhere in that neighborhood. We know that in today's world, a grown man being married to a 13, 14-year-old is pedophilia. It's illegal in our culture, so it's a sin. So if a grown man today had sex with a 13, 14-year-old, we would say that he was sinning. Why? Because he's breaking our law, breaking our cultural law. But there are still countries today, like in India, where you can be 13, 14, still get married, have babies. So it's not illegal. It's not a sin. But it is here. There was a part in the Bible where there are plenty of parts where they went and they conquered. They were told to conquer by God and kill every man, every woman that has known a man. Kill every animal. But for the young girls who haven't known a man, take them as your wives. What we don't think about is that some of those wives would have been 8, 9 years old. Pedophilia was encouraged. Pedophilia wasn't a sin. It wasn't looked down upon. A woman hit her menstrual cycle, she's considered a woman. Many Hebrew Israelites will tell you that. A woman hits her menstrual cycle, she's a woman. She's not a child. But you don't see Hebrew Israelites in America trying to marry them. Why? Because it's illegal. They're conformed to the culture, not conformed to the religion. Now, let's think about that and keep going with it. Onan was killed by God. Why? If If you don't know the story, Onan's brother was married to his wife. They didn't produce a son, didn't produce a child. Onan died, his brother died. I forgot why he died, the whole circumstances around it. And then Onan, because of their culture of keeping it in the family, because Onan didn't have a wife yet, keeping it in the family, Onan had to marry his brother's widow. But then Onan didn't want to have a baby by his brother's widow. So he pulled out. You know what I'm saying? He pulled out. When they were having sex, he pulled out and spilled his seed on the ground. And God killed him for spilling his seed on the ground. What's the real story here? God killed him because he's trying not to produce a child. He's keeping the village production. So in effect, they've made masturbation a sin. They've made pulling out of a woman when you're having sex a sin. So for any of you who are saying that, oh, I had sex with a woman but I'm pulling out, you're sinning. If you're Christian, you're Muslim, if you're Jewish and you're pulling out, you're committing a sin. Now some of you will say that, well, you're fornicating already, so you're already sinning. Well, if you actually look up the word fornicating, when Paul was talking to the Greeks about they need to stop fornication, in the Greek, and it was written in Greek, that word meant having sex with little boys. Stop having sex with boys. That's what fornicating is, with young boys. It wasn't having sex out of wedlock. There's only two kinds of sex that you have as far as relationships are concerned when you look at these books, look at these writings. Having sex is what starts the marriage, right? That's what begins it. It is not a ceremony that you go through. It is not anything like that. How you doing, sir? It's not a ceremony that you go through. It is the fact that you decided to have sex with someone. That begins the marriage. The role of the best man was to announce when the couple consummated the marriage and they became married. So in these beliefs, if you was conformed to the religion and not to the culture, marriage began when you had sex. And if you had sex with anybody else, that's adultery. So there's only sex to initiate a marriage and adultery, plain and simple. And just a quick answer, you want to get divorced, stop having sex for 30, 40 days. Don't see the woman or man for 30, 40 days. Don't live in the same household for 30, 40 days. And you're divorced. But every time you have sex, you're remarrying the person. You're reestablishing the covenant between you. This is why Paul said don't go too long with abstaining from sex, or otherwise you invite the devil in. But don't go too long, and that your body is not yours and yours belong to your spouse. But all that other stuff we do is ceremonious things that we do as a culture. So anyway, fornicating was having sex with young boys. And you go to many other cultures, and I don't know how true this is or if it's still true, but in 1990s, early 90s, when I went to Saudi Arabia, we were told in our briefings that don't be appalled when you see grown men holding hands with young boys. When you see grown men being affectionate to young boys, don't be offended by that, because in their culture, grown men have sex with young boys. This is before we got to Bahrain and Dubai and Saudi Arabia and all these other countries. I don't know if that still holds true today. I don't even know how true that was during that time frame. But in our debriefing, we were told, don't be offended when we see that. So, as far as I know, those cultures still hold that to be true. They still hold that to be true. That they still fornicate as far as Paul is concerned. But fornicating was with young boys, not having sex out of wedlock. Having sex out of wedlock with someone is adultery. But we've conformed the religion, or men, and when I say we, I mean men, has conformed the religion to culture. You see, back in those days, if you had sex, just like when it talks about if the young maiden is found, if young maiden is captured by a man and he has sex with her, he rapes her, and they find out, you get caught, then all he has to do is pay his father 50 pieces of silver, and all of a sudden now the daughter has to marry that man. They're looking at keeping the value of the woman, because her value was only based on being able to produce children and being married. And they're looking at the value of keeping the community. Those rules, those laws were there to keep the community, and they put God's name on it. So when we talk about these things, we have to remember that we're not conforming religious culture to the religion. We're doing the exact opposite. Religion to the culture. So why do we need to understand this? Why do we need to think about things like that? Because as people go around teaching these lessons and teaching their religion and claiming to be the religion of God, you have to not just be able to know what the words mean, not just know what the doctrine means today, but you should have a better understanding of what it meant historically. I like to say, I don't just read it, and people always say, are you reading it out of context? No, I'm not reading it out of context. You're not reading it in the spirit. No, I'm not reading it out of the spirit. I'm reading it by indexing it. What did it mean to that culture? Why did it mean that to that culture? If you can't do that, you don't know what you're reading. KRS-One. If you don't know the history of the author, then you don't know what you're reading. You claim that Moses wrote it. What's the history of Moses? What is the thought process of Moses? What's the history of the culture of that day? What was Aaron's culture when it was written? What was anybody's culture when it was written? The oldest manuscripts of the New Testament found that they only date back to about 100 AD, well, CE, Common Era. What's the culture at that time frame? You think the Romans are going to tell you that having sex with young boys was a sin? No, they had sex all the time with young boys. The Romans had slaves. Do you think the Romans were going to tell you that slavery was wrong? The Romans had slaves. The Romans had sex with young girls, married young girls. You think the Romans were going to tell you that pedophilia is wrong? No, they're not going to tell you that. You ask me why the Romans? Because your New Testament was written during the Roman time. The Old Testament was written during the Roman times, and the Greeks, and actually the Septuagint during the Greek time frame. These cultures had sex with young girls. These cultures married young girls. Pedophilia is not going to be wrong. It's not going to be in your Bible as wrong. But if somebody wrote the Bible today, it would be wrong. Let me put it in some more modern context for you. In the modern day world, like I said earlier, Canada is saying that any Bible that has homosexuality as an abomination can't be sold in Canada. That being the case, the generation that's born today, if they only read a Canadian Bible, they will never think that homosexuality is an abomination to God, nor is it a sin. Then they will teach their children that homosexuality is not an abomination, it's not a sin. Homosexuality is okay, it's all right. God made them that way. That is what they will teach their children. So in 20 years, 20, 30 years, you will have a whole country in Canada. I think they outlawed that about 10, 15 years ago. But you'll have a whole country that doesn't conform to that. That no one in that country, most of the people will have started to die out who read Bibles beforehand. It only takes 2 generations, 40 years to start making those changes, 80 years to start making those changes. So all of those people will start to change. All those people will have a different thought. Canada won't think that way. But countries like America, you might. But these things are changing, as you saw by the churches that I showed you the pictures of. These things are changing. Let's look at something else a little bit different, a little modern. I was born in 1971, meaning I was born after Dr. King died. Now, with me being born after Dr. King died, I don't know him personally. I am not an eyewitness to nothing of Dr. King. But what I do have is Dr. King's letters, just like you have Paul's letters. From his letters, I can extrapolate things. So think about it. Paul wrote to the church of Corinth. I had it taught to me that when he said that women, keep your women silent in the churches, for I suffer them not to speak nor usurp the authority of a man, that was God saying that women can't be pastors and priests, that women don't preach, still used in the Catholic, that women can't speak in the church, speak God's word. Many other religions still do that. This is based on letters that Paul wrote to a church. So in the religion of King, religion of Dr. King, where he's the savior, his letters that he wrote from the Birmingham jail will become gospel. I don't know him. And if I decided when I'm 80, in about 40 40 more years, well, actually less than that, 33 more years. So let's say I waited till I was 90, 43 years later, to write about Dr. King. There are no eyewitnesses around. Almost every eyewitness would be dead. Everyone who was an eyewitness would be dead. There was no one to challenge what I wrote. You may have some videos, but if I wrote about him personally, you can't challenge it because there's no eyewitnesses around to challenge it. Paul wrote his letters, and gospels have come from those letters. There's no one to challenge or know what Paul was thinking. Later on, I've heard it being taught in churches that allow women to teach, that say that, well, what was really going on is that Paul was just saying that women were being very disruptive at that time. They was causing problems at that time in the church. So Paul wanted to shut the problems down. So he said women shouldn't speak in the church, but that was just for that time. The doctrine changed after the 1950s. It began changing, and the reason that happened is because of women's suffrage, women's rights. So we change based on our culture. We change religion. Religion doesn't change the culture. So as we continue to go forward, as people say, keep on living, as you keep on living, you'll come to realize that we keep changing religion, keep changing God based on our culture. But really, you got to find the God inside yourself. If you got to get to the basics. This is why when I really teach, I teach the basics. I tell them in the previous video, love is based on how you love yourself, and then translate that same love to whomever else you're around, whomever else you're with. Love yourself as you love a neighbor. Love your neighbor. That's beautiful, beautiful wisdom. Do unto others, you have them do unto you. Beautiful wisdom. I don't care where it comes from, but that's what true love really is. So understand the doctrine, when it was written, how it was written, who wrote it, why they wrote it, what they was writing it for, what was their purpose, what was their culture, what is their history. You got to get all that in. But love is always sustainable. Treating people right is always sustainable. So I want you guys to really take that into heart. So remember, you have to love yourself in order to be that kind of love. And you really have to study. The people say study to see yourself approved. Most of y'all don't really study. So I'm challenging you to study deeper. And remember, you got to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable.